The Rock and Roll Unraveled Show. I'm Derek Shelmerdine. Welcome to another Rock and Roll Unraveled show. Well, 2019 marks the 50th anniversary of Woodstock, the most famous festival of them all. It was on the 15th, 16th and 17th of August 1969. Well, it's a great opportunity to take a look at some of the other landmarks of 1969, and it's amazing how many of them have links to Woodstock. Wow, it was a time of change. The 15th of August 2019 was the 50th anniversary of the first day of Woodstock. It was billed as 3 days of peace and music. It was on Max Yasgur's dairy farm in upstate New York. History recalls the event as Woodstock, but Yasgur's farm was nearly 50 miles away in Bethel, Sullivan County. Now, it was moved because of concerns about the number of people who were likely to attend, and the local authorities declined to issue the appropriate licenses. Well, the whole thing did get staged, but it was wet. It was very wet. But despite the rain, an estimated 400,000 to 500,000 people turned up for the gig. Well, Woodstock featured a host of bands. There were some great American West Coast bands there. Jefferson Airplane, Grateful Dead, Country Joe and the Fish, and some British bands 10 years after. Well, one of my all-time favourite bands, Jeff Beck Group, Joe Cocker, and the Incredible String Band with their psychedelic folk music. There were legends like Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix. By Woodstock, Noel Redding had already moved on, and the Jimi Hendrix Experience was no more. And at Woodstock, Hendrix performed as Gypsy Sun and Rainbows. Now, Mitch Mitchell was still there, but bassist Billy Cox had taken Noel Redding's place. But by the end of December, the band was back to being a trio, and they were now calling themselves the Band of Gypsies, and they famously recorded an album on the 31st of December at the Fillmore East as a trio, and that was with Buddy Miles, who then replaced Mitch Mitchell. Now, Band of Gypsies was a short-lived affair and lasted only about a month. And Ravi Shankar was there. He was a sitar player, very popular at the time, and apparently he had a standing ovation for what turned out to be 15 minutes of just tuning his sitar. Well, The Who played the gig, and famously Abbie Hoffman invaded the stage when The Who were on. And he was protesting about John Sinclair's prison term. Now, Pete Townsend gave very short shrift to this and told him in absolutely no uncertain terms to get off my stage, which he did. Now, John Sinclair, well, he was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, believe it or not, for the possession of 2 joints. He was sentenced in the July of 67 and released on the 13th of December 1971. He'd previously been the manager of rock band MC5. Really good band if ever you get a chance to check their stuff out. Now, there were a couple of other really interesting festivals in 1969. On the 13th of September, it was the Toronto Rock and Roll Revival Festival, and that was in Canada at the Varsity Stadium. And it was a rare opportunity to see performances from some 1950s and 1960s rock and roll royalty. Well, the Doors headlined the bill, and it included Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Jerry Lee Lewis, Bo Diddley and Gene Vincent. Wow, at one gig. And also Alice Cooper, Chicago Transit Authority, as they called themselves in the early days, later dropped the Transit Authority and just became Chicago, and Screaming Lord Sutch. Great to see him at a gig like that. But the one-day festival is very much remembered for the fact that it was the debut of John Lennon's Plastic Ono Band. Now, the lineup for that, as well as John and Yoko, was guitarist Eric Clapton, bassist Klaus Voormann, and future Yes drummer Alan White. Now, the band was put together at the last minute and famously had their main rehearsal on the plane going over to the gig. If you want to hear that debut performance of John Lennon's Plastic Ono Band, check out the album Live Peace in Toronto, 1969. But sadly, not such a joyous event. On the 6th of December 1969, it was the ill-fated Altamont concert. Now, this was a free concert and the final show on the Rolling Stones' 1969 US tour. It wasn't technically part of the tour, but they were keen to give a free concert. That was very much the way of the world in the late 1960s. And it was another relocated festival. It was originally planned to be staged at San Francisco at the Golden Gate Park, but it was relocated to Altamont Raceway in Livermore, Northern California. Now, the Stones had used the Hells Angels as security at their free concert in Hyde Park on July the 5th, and they thought it would be a good idea to employ them again, but this time, oh dear me, no, had absolutely disastrous results. I mean, violence escalated throughout the day. Jefferson Airplane's Marty Berlin was KO'd by one of the Angels. And during the Stones performance, Meredith Hunter, who was standing near the front of the stage, pulled out a gun. And one of the Hells Angels, Alan Passaro, tackled him and stabbed him to death. The incident's actually caught on the amazing documentary film, Gimme Shelter, well worth checking out. Now, Passaro was charged with murder, but acquitted. Now, lots of great people on this bill. I mean, Santana, Jefferson Airplane were at Woodstock, and also the Flying Burrito Brothers and Crosby, Stills and Nash. They were also at Woodstock. Now, the Grateful Dead were due to play, but pulled out because of the escalating violence. They wanted no part of it. Now, Altamont is often cited as the spiritual end of the 1960s, the end of the hippie dream of optimism. Now, for our first piece of music, well, it's one that Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young had their third American hit with, gave them a number 11. Matthew's Southern Comfort actually had a UK number 1, and the song is Joni Mitchell's Woodstock. She wrote it, and it appeared on her album, Ladies of the Canyon. Now, she wasn't actually at Woodstock, but this is the definitive version of the song. This is Joni Mitchell and Woodstock. There were some great new bands finding fame in 1969. Crosby, Stills and Nash, well, by the time they got to Woodstock, as they say, they'd already had their first album and first single release. Their first album came out in the May, simply called Crosby, Stills and Nash, and it spawned 2 American hit singles, Marrakesh Express and Sweet Judy Blue Eyes. And that Marrakesh Express was a hit in the July, actually written by Graham Nash, the British member of the band. It gave them a number 28 in America, and it was also their first hit in the UK, gave them a number 17. Now, when the band got together, Stephen Stills' manager, David Geffen, well, he approached Jerry Wexler to release Stephen Stills from his Atlantic contract. He wanted to take the new group to Columbia Records. But the guy that founded Atlantic, Ahmet Ertegun, he persuaded David Geffen to bring the lads to Atlantic, and that's exactly what happened. They became one of Atlantic's big recording acts. And they played their first gig 3 weeks before Woodstock at New York's Fillmore East. And at the end of the gig, they were joined by Neil Young on stage. There's a lot of association between Neil Young and Crosby, Stills and Nash. The band came together when David Crosby was sacked from the Byrds, and Steve Stills had been with Neil Young in Buffalo Springfield, and the band imploded rather sadly, and Graham Nash had been with the Hollies. They played their last gig together in the December of 1968. There was also a new generation of singer-songwriters emerging in 1969. Now, the 60s had seen a plethora of songwriters, many centred around New York's Greenwich Village in the early 1960s. I mean, the likes of Bob Dylan and Phil Ochs, who became leading lights in the protest movement, but also people like Tim Rhodes, Tim Hardin and Fred Neil. They were very active on the Greenwich Village scene. And James Taylor released his first album on the 17th of February 1969. Again, eponymous, just called James Taylor. And that was really the dawn of the next generation of singer-songwriters. And he was the first non-Beatle to release an album on the Beatles' Apple label. His was the third after George Harrison's Wonderwall and John Lennon's Two Virgins. Now, this new generation of singer-songwriters had seen a couple of guys who'd had a go in the 60s with limited success. Harry Chapin released Chapin Music as the Chapin Brothers, and Warren Zevon released his first album, Wanted Dead or Alive, but it wasn't until the 1970s that they found sustained success. And they are two of, in my opinion, the best singer-songwriters of all time. Love those guys. One of the bands to come together at this time was the Allman Brothers Band. They had their first gig on the 30th of March 1969, and Rolling Stone magazine rates Duane Allman as the 9th greatest guitarist of all times. Now, they've been around for a while in various guises. They played their first gig as Allman Joys on the 4th of July 1965 in the sort of Daytona Beach, Florida area. And it was by 1967 that they'd morphed into the Hourglass after being in various bands with various names. And it was when they relocated to LA that they changed their name to Hourglass. And the founding members there were the Allman Brothers, Duane and Greg being the organist. And Hourglass stayed together till the sort of latter end of 1968 when they went their separate ways. And the Allman Brothers Band played its first gig, as I say, on the 30th of March, and that was just 4 days after they formed at the legendary Jacksonville Jam at Jacksonville Armory, Jacksonville, Florida. At the Jam, all of the Allman Brothers Band performed, and that was the dual lead guitars of Duane Allman and Dickie Betts, Greg Allman on keyboards, bassist Berry Oakley, and drummers Jamie Johansson and Butch Trucks. For this first gig, Greg Allman was actually unavailable, so he was replaced on keyboards by Reese Winans. And somebody else who broke through, as it were, in 1969 was Alice Cooper. On the 19th of May 1969, they released their first single, Reflected. Alice Cooper, of course, was still the name of the band at this point. Now, they'd sort of come together back in March of 1964 as the Earwigs, and then it became the Spiders and Naz with 2 Zs, and finally Alice Cooper. Now, that was Glenn Buxton guitar and Vincent Furnier, the singer, and it was Vincent Furnier who later decided that he'd take the name of the band for his own, and he became Alice Cooper. Now, the first gig as the band Alice Cooper was on the 16th of March 1968, and when they released this first single in 1969, Reflected, it was the first single on Frank Zappa's new straight label, so it's a first for Zappa as well. And at this time, of course, Alice Cooper was still the name of the band. And there were a number of British bands breaking ground at the time of Woodstock. Genesis, there's a band that went on to some degree of fame. On the 7th of March 1969, they released their first album, From Genesis to Revelation. Now, they'd all met at Charterhouse Public School in Surrey. That's Peter Gabriel, Tony Banks, Mike Rutherford. And one day, old boy Jonathan King came to the school, and they managed to smuggle a tape that they'd made with some of their recordings to him. He liked it, and he signed them up to Decca. He was the one who actually gave them the name Genesis. Now, while they were at Decca, they recorded an album and 3 singles, none of which really troubled the charts or brought them much fame, and Decca dropped them. It was not till the early 70s that they really found success. Another pretty colossal name in rock history, Led Zeppelin. Well, on the 28th of March 1969, they released their first album in the UK. This was actually 10 weeks after its American release. They were formed by Jimmy Page and manager Peter Grant after the Yardbirds all party company in mid-1968. Now, the singer, Robert Plant, he wasn't actually the first choice for the band. Teddy Reid was approached, but he turned it down and suggested Robert Plant, who'd been with Hobstweedle. Now, there's a great name for a band. And he'd played in various bands earlier on with John Bonham. So he suggested John Bonham for the role of drummer, and he was hoiked out of Tim Rose's touring band, much to the annoyance at the time of legendary singer Tim Rose. And the bassist, John Paul Jones, well, he was a prolific session musician. And he'd been a big chum of Jimmy Page's, so he came on board. Now, John Paul Jones had actually been on the road with Jet Harris and Tony Meehan in the early days. Interesting bunch of guys. And the band that's usually referred to as a band's band. And they actually decided they would call themselves The Band. Now, they had their first gig as The Band at San Francisco's Winterland. The band did appear at Woodstock. And that first gig at Winterland was on the 17th of April, 69. But they'd been around for a long time. They'd formed in the early 60s as the Hawks to back Ronnie Hawkins. And they were a Canadian band, essentially, with the exception of Levon Helm, who was the only American. He was born in Arkansas. And they found fame backing Bob Dylan. They backed him as the Hawks and then as the band. And as the Hawks, they backed him on his infamous 1966 Electric tour. And this is from the band's first album. This is from music from Big Pink and the band with The Weight. You're listening to Derek Shelmerdine with the Rock and Roll Unravelled show. We're looking at the awesome year that was 1969, the year of Woodstock and a host of rock and roll landmarks. But before continuing the story, whoa, there's an opportunity to win a signed copy of my book, Rock and Roll Unravelled. Now, every month I run a quiz in conjunction with this show, the Rock and Roll Unravelled show. And for the current quiz, just check out the homepage on my website, rockandrollunravelled.com. Follow the link to the quiz at the top of the homepage and send me the answer. And I'll send a signed copy of Rock and Roll Unravelled to the lucky winner anywhere in the world. Well, Rock and Roll Unravelled tells a story of rock and roll from its roots to mid-1970s punk. And the UK Record Collector magazine's review described the book as comprehensive and invaluable. Thank you, Record Collector. Well, good luck with the competition, but meanwhile, back to the plot. Well, what we're looking at now is some ends of eras, and 1969 had quite a few end of eras. On the 1st of July 69, Sam Phillips sold Sun Records to Shelby Singleton. Now, he'd opened his Memphis recording service in 1950, and on the 5th of March 1951, he recorded Rocket 88 with Jackie Brenston and his Delta Cats, and that's generally considered to be the first rock and roll record. Well, it wasn't released on Sun, it was released on Chess, and that's because the Sun label didn't arrive for best part of another year. On the 1st of March 1952, the first release on Sun was Johnny London with Driving Slow. Now, he had mixed fortunes, did Mr. Phillips at Sun Records. He discovered Elvis Presley, and in fact it was the 18th of July 53 that Elvis Presley made his first visit to the Memphis recording service for a private recording. And then he signed up to Sun, and he released 5 singles on Sun, but didn't find any success until he moved on and joined RCA, and then became the king of rock and roll, of course. Now, Sun did have considerable success with a number of people. Two of the really big ones would be Jerry Lee Lewis and Carl Perkins. And it was Carl Perkins who gave Sun its first million seller with Blue Suede Shoes. Now, again, same as the Elvis story, really. Very little commercial success for Roy Orbison or Johnny Cash at Sun, but they both found international fame after they moved on and signed to new record labels. And the one that got away, well, that's Harold Jenkins, probably better known as Conway Twitty. If you go to Conway Twitty's website, it suggests that he's sold 50 million plus albums and has had 55 number one singles. And the name Conway Twitty, well, that comes from a couple of American towns, Conway in Arkansas and Twitty in Texas. And one of the great rock bands, Cream. Well, on the 1st of March 1969, they released their final album, Goodbye. They'd played their farewell concerts the previous October. Now, Cream formed in 1966 as the first supergroup. That's, of course, Eric Clapton, Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker. And they were very much the first wave of rock bands. And Frank Zappa, name you don't hear too often on radio, but I like to mention him wherever possible. On the 20th of August 1969, Frank Zappa disbanded his Mothers of Invention. He felt it was too expensive to keep a full band on retainer when they weren't on the road. Now, on the 23rd of February 1963, he recorded the Penguins' Memories of El Monte. That's an American recording date. And it was written by Zappa and Ray Collins and produced by Zappa, and was recorded at PAL Studios at Cucamonga. Now, on the 1st of August 64, Zappa bought those studios and renamed them Studio Z. And Zappa very, very nearly released the first rock opera some years before Tommy hit the streets. On the 2nd of December 1964, KNXT, a branch of CBS, rejected the rock opera outline for I Was a Teenage Malt Shop. So sadly that project never came to fruition. But Zappa himself joined the Soul Giants in mid-65, and that's when they became the Mothers of Invention. And up until he disbanded them, they released 5 classic albums on Verve in the UK, very worth checking out. And one of the icons of rock, I don't use that word too often, but you can certainly use it for Jimi Hendrix. Sad day, on the 29th of June 1969, it was the last gig of the original lineup of the Jimi Hendrix Experience, and that was Hendrix with drummer Mitch Mitchell and bassist Noel Redding, and that was at Denver Pop Festival at the Mile High Stadium in Denver, Colorado. Now, they'd released their 3rd UK album, Electric Ladyland, the previous October. And it was very much during the recording of that album that things all soured for Chas Chandler and Noel Redding. Chas Chandler was the manager. Now, Noel Redding went off and he formed Fat Mattress. He returned to guitar, because he was a guitarist before he joined Hendrix as the bass player, and of course lead vocals. And a lot of fun. He opened for Jimi Hendrix on his US tour. So on that last US tour, Noel Redding played in both the support band and the main band. That must have been quite a lot of fun. And Chas Chandler, well, he stayed in management and he went to manage Slade. And talking of 1969 anniversaries, on the 4th of October, The Slade released their first single, Wild Winds Are Blowing. Jimi Hendrix and drummer Mitch Mitchell, they did go on to play at Woodstock. And they called themselves Gypsy, Sun and Rainbows, and there were quite a few people added to the lineup for that particular gig. Now, the Vietnam War, a great influence on the music of the 1960s. In fact, protest singers Joan Baez and Arlo Guthrie, well, they were at Woodstock. The Vietnam War for America started in 1954 after the defeat of the colonial French forces at Dien Bien Phu, and it escalated throughout the 1960s. In fact, the number of troops reached its peak on the 30th of April 69 when there were 543,482 soldiers actively out there. Ironically, by mid-69 it was also the beginning of the end of the war. On the 8th of June 1969, President Nixon announced that he was making the first troop withdrawals from Vietnam. I mean, the war soldiered on for some years yet, but basically it was running down now. And Country Joe and the Fish, mentioned earlier, they played Woodstock. And as a note, Country Joe, his name comes from a sort of doff of the cap to Russian communist leader Joe Stalin. His nickname, Stalin's nickname, was Country Joe. Now, Country Joe and the Fish formed around the autumn of 1965 with Country Joe McDonald as the singer and guitarist Barry the Fish Melton. Now, they released their first album in the April of 67, and that was Electric Music for Mind and Body, and their second album that November, and that was I Feel Like I'm Fixing to Die, and they're both American release dates. And I thought it'd be great to take a Vietnam War classic song, as it were, actually recorded at Woodstock, and it's got a little taste of Woodstock at the end, and you'll see what I mean. And this is Country Joe and the Fish, I Feel Like I'm Fixing to Die, Rag. Rock and roll was really developing in the late 1960s. At least 5 new genres emerged around the time of Woodstock. Black Sabbath, very much pioneers of heavy metal. They had their first gig as Black Sabbath on the 27th of September 1969, and that was at the Drill Hall in Dumfries, Scotland, a very unlikely setting for the beginnings of heavy metal. Well, they sort of came together in mid-68 as the Polka Tulk Blues Band. It was formed when Terry, Geezer Butler, Tony Iommi, Bill Ward and Ozzy Osbourne got together. In fact, Ozzy Osbourne and Geezer Butler were together previously in the Rare Breed before they joined up with the others in Polka Tulk. On the 1st of September 1968, Polka Tulk changed its name to Earth, then Black Sabbath to avoid confusion with another band called Earth. And they took the name Black Sabbath from a 1963 Boris Karloff movie. Now, on the 11th of December 68, the Rolling Stones recorded their TV special, Rock and Roll Circus. It was actually Brian Jones' last live performance with the band. And it's famous for a number of reasons. The acts included John Lennon's Dirty Mac, that was Eric Clapton, Mitch Mitchell and Keith Richard on bass, and that was John Lennon's first appearance outside of the Beatles. But the reason we got this in here with Black Sabbath is that guitarist Tony Iommi was a part of Jethro Tull at that recording. He'd left Earth and was with Jethro Tull, well, briefly to say the least, and he went back, didn't like it, joined Earth, and they changed their name to Black Sabbath shortly afterwards. One interesting thing about it is that Who were on, and they performed a quick one while he's away. An urban myth has it that Mick Jagger didn't sanction the release of the TV show at the time because he thought they'd been totally upstaged by The Who. In fact, it didn't come out until a DVD release in 1996. Now, Ozzy Osbourne, lead singer with Black Sabbath, he famously bit the head off a live bat, and that was at a gig in Des Moines in Iowa in 1982. What happened was a fan threw a bat onto the stage. Ozzy Osbourne picked it up and thought it was made of rubber, so he thought, "Oh, I'll bite the head off this." And as he did, he realised that the bat was indeed alive. The bat took a dim view of it and bit him back. Well, that's a nice little piece of rock and roll fun. Jazz rock fusion, that also arrived in 1969. On the 19th of August, Miles Davis started recording his Bitches Brew album. That's very much seen as the birth of jazz rock fusion. Davis is a jazz trumpeter, very, very respected in rock circles. He'd been around a while. I mean, in the late 40s, he'd recorded the legendary Birth of the Cool album. Now, the musicians on this Bitches Brew album, well, they went off and they set up their own jazz rock fusion bands. Miles Davis was the trumpeter, and guitarist John McLaughlin and drummer Billy Cobham, they went off and put Mahavishnu Orchestra together. Pianist Joe Zawinul and saxophonist Wayne Shorter, they formed Weather Report. And Chick Corea decided to form Return to Forever, 3 very, very classic jazz rock fusion bands. And the bass player on this particular album, on the Bitches Brew, was ex-Electric Flag bassist Harvey Brooks. Now, Hawkwind also made an appearance at 1969. On the 29th of August, it was Hawkwind's first gig, albeit they were calling themselves Group X. And this is really when space rock made its appearance. And they played a 20-minute jam at the All Saints Hall in Notting Hill. And that lineup included a long-term member Dave Brock. They changed their name from Group X to Hawkwind shortly afterwards. Now, the next one's interesting. Prog rock. I mean, started very much out in the 1960s, mid-late 1960s, and famed for its 20-minute live guitar and drum solos, and a single track taking up the whole side of an LP. But the excesses of prog rock were growing, and by the time we get to 1969, they're actually performing with full orchestras, and that became known as pomp rock. And Procol Harum were well at the fore to this. On the 6th of July 69, they performed at the Stratford Festival in Ontario, Canada, with a full orchestra, and that was the Stratford Festival Orchestra and Festival Rock Chorus. Interesting concept. And they were all conducted by Lawrence Smith. And following a couple of pieces by J.S. Bach, the programme lists the items premiered by Procol Harum and Orchestra as A Salty Dog, In Held 'Twas in I, now that's a great title for a song, Repentant Walpurgis, A Whiter Shade of Pale, Stoke Poges, and Skip Softly My Moonbeams. That sounds rather gentle. And on the 24th of September 1969, Deep Purple were making live recordings with orchestras, and that's when they recorded their Concerto for Group and Orchestra, and that was at London's Royal Albert Hall with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, conducted by Malcolm Arnold. Now, the piece was in 3 movements. It was composed by Deep Purple's keyboard player John Lord, and lyrics were courtesy of singer Ian Gillan. And it's a bit of a landmark album in a number of ways for Deep Purple, because it was the first album to feature Ian Gillan. He just replaced Rod Evans, and it also the first outing for bass player Roger Glover. He just replaced Nick Simper. Ian Gillan and Roger Glover, of course, have previously been with Episode 6, a very well respected UK R&B band. And this really marked the beginning of the classic Deep Purple lineup of John Lord keyboards, Ian Pace drums, Ritchie Blackmore guitar, Roger Glover bass, and Ian Gillan vocals. And spookily enough, on the same day as Deep Purple were making their live concerto recording, 24th of September 1969, Fairport Convention were premiering their 4th album, Liege and Leaf, at the Royal Festival Hall. The album hadn't actually been released yet. Now, they'd been together for a couple of years before this. They sort of had their first gig in the May of 1967, and that was in a church hall. And Martin Lamble was in the audience, and after the gig he went up to the band and said to them, "Well, I can play better than your existing drummer." That was Sean Frater, and the band agreed with him, and Martin Lamble became the group's drummer. Another major change of personnel came with Sandy Denny. She joined in the May of '68, and she replaced original singer Judy Dibble. Now, Liege and Leaf was advertised as the first British folk rock album, and Sandy Denny left shortly afterwards and formed Fotheringay. Now, Fairport Convention weren't actually at Woodstock, but Ian Matthews was an early member of Fairport Convention. He left in '69 and formed Matthews Southern Comfort. As we heard earlier, he had a number 1 in the UK with a cover of Joni Mitchell's Woodstock. Now, an awful lot of the bands and artists I've talked about in the show are on tour now. And to check out the latest info of where they are, the dates and the venues, check out my website at rockandrollunraveled.com. And at the top you'll see something called 1960s-70s Artists Touring Now. Take it from me, if they're still alive, you'll find these guys out on the road. So at any time, just check for your favourite 60s and 70s artists. There's a good chance that their tour details are on my website. Now, there's also a companion blog for the show, and that's got links to all of the songs mentioned in the show, so have a listen to the songs. Again, it's on the website rockandrollunraveled.com, and that's at the top under Rock and Roll History. Well, that's it. I've been Derek Shelmerdine. You've been listening to the Rock and Roll Unraveled show and the story of Woodstock and some of the landmark events of 1969. I hope you've enjoyed the show as much as I have in putting the whole thing together. If you're into social media, I'm on Twitter at RNR Unraveled and Facebook at Rock and Roll Unraveled. And remember, you can win a copy of my book, Rock and Roll Unraveled. Simply go to the website homepage at rockandrollunraveled.com. Click on the link to the competition and I'll post a signed copy of the book to the lucky winner anywhere in the world. Well, good luck with the competition, and please join me again next time for another look at a little piece of rock and roll unraveled. Now, to play us out from Liege and Leaf, this is Fairport Convention with Farewell, Farewell.